Section 12 of the Story of London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley Jones. The Story of London by Henry B. Wheatley. Chapter 7. Health, Disease and Sanitation. Part 2. Hospitals. St. Bartholomew's Hospital. We are justly proud of the hospitals of the 20th century, but one of them stands out from the rest on account of its early foundation and its enormous influence on the growth of professional feeling. In following the incidents in the history of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, we cannot doubt but that this is one of the most noblest institutions in London. The hospital was founded by Rahere in 1123 and refounded in 1546. We have little history of the earlier period, but the documents relating to the refoundation evidently echo the sentiments formed during the earlier period. Dr. Norman Moore, in his paper on the progress of medicine at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, 1888, writes, quote, "We are in the very middle of the sacred land of medicine, and many of the great events in the history of medicine are connected with the particular region in which our hospital is, or have occurred in our hospital itself." End quote. Rahere, while building the hospital, continued his labours by founding the priory, of which all that now remains is the Church of St. Bartholomew the Great. This consists of the choir and transept of the church of the priory, and a part of the site of the close is marked by the present Bartholomew Close. The hospital and the priory were independent, but connected. The relations between the two were revised by Richard de Ely, Bishop of London, in 1197, by Eustace de Fauconberg, Bishop of London, in 1224, and by Simon of Sudbury, Bishop of London, in 1373, and the two foundations were finally separated on the dissolution of the priory in 1537. There is in the British Museum, Cotton Manuscript Vespasian, Book 9, a life of Rahere written by one who had known those who knew the founder. The manuscript is a copy of an earlier one written in the reign of Henry II, within 50 years of the foundation of the hospital. This work, which is of great value, is described by Dr. Norman Moore and analysed in Mr. Morant Baker's Two Foundations of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, AD 1123 and AD 1546. Rahere has been described as the king's minstrel or jester, but there is no authority for this. The writer of his life says that he was a frequenter of the palace and of noblemen's houses, and made himself so agreeable as to be highly esteemed as the leader of tumultuous pleasures. He was, however, converted to a better state of life, but probably, as is the wont of those who write about conversions, the author rather darkens the picture of the courtier's early follies. Rahere determined to go to Rome, and after visiting the shrines of St. Peter and St. Paul, he was taken ill with a grievous sickness. He feared that God was angry with him for his sins, and he vowed that if God would give him health so that he might return to his own country, quote, he would make an hospital in recreation of poor men, and to them so there gathered necessaries minister after his power. End quote. In the night he saw a vision which filled him with dread. He seemed to be borne up on high by a beast having 4 feet and 2 wings, and set down in a high place. From this great height he looked into a deep pit, and he feared to slide down into it. Then appeared to him a certain man of great beauty and majesty, who fastened his eye upon him and said, O man, what and how much service shouldst thou give to him that in so great peril hath brought help to thee? Rahere answered, Whatsoever might be of heart and of might, diligently should I give, in recompense to my deliverer. So the kingly man spoke again, I am Bartholomew, the apostle of Jesus Christ, that came to succour thee in thine anguish, and to open to thee the secret mysteries of heaven. know me truly by the will and commandment of the Holy Trinity, and the common favour of the Celestial Court and Council, to have chosen a place in the suburbs of London at Smithfield, where in my name thou shalt found a church, and it shall be the house of God. My part shall be to provide necessaries, direct, build, and end this work, and this place to me accept with evident tokens and signs, protect and defend continually it under my wings. And therefore of this work know me the master, and thyself only the minister. Use diligently thy service, and I shall show my lordship. Rahere, when he got back to London, made overtures to the citizens for the purpose of obtaining the land he required for building, and the authorities were favourable to his scheme, but they could not settle the matter until Henry I had been consulted, because the place at Smithfield was within the king's market. When the petitioner applied to the king, his plea was acceded to, and he was given authority to execute his purpose. It is not quite clear where all the money came from for the carrying out so vast an undertaking. But Rahere had a winning way, and from the king downwards he appears to have obtained liberal help. Before he could build, he had to drain the land, which was nothing but a marsh, and when he went there, the only sign of civilization was a gibbet. The hospital, which from the first was a hospital for the sick, and not a mere almshouse, had a master, 8 brethren, and 4 sisters. The first master was Alphon, an old man who had previously built the church of St. Giles, Cripplegate, and Rahere was the first prior. Alphon was also styled hospitaller or proctor of the poor, and the writer of the manuscript Life of Rahere tells how it was the custom of Alphon to go about begging for provisions and other necessaries for the poor men that lay in the hospital. He also looked after the welfare of those who were employed in building the church. Rahere had many troubles in his later life, and a large number of envious enemies spoke evil of him and did him injuries. There was a plot against his life, which failed on account of the confession of a penitent conspirator. He had, however, a good friend in the king, who helped him and confirmed his previous grant by a charter which gave full liberty and great privileges to the priory and hospital. When, therefore, Rahere died, after having been prior for 22 years and 6 months, he left his great establishment in a prosperous condition. Dr. Norman Moore points out that in the Life of Rahere there is an account of the admission of the first patients of which we have any record. This was a man named Adwin, who came up to London from Dunwich in Suffolk in the reign of Henry II. There are many records of people who were supposed to be healed by praying at Rahere's tomb, but this man is described as having been admitted into the hospital, and therefore a genuine patient. He was discharged cured, but although his condition is described, no details of his treatment are given. Dr. Moore supposes that by long lying in bed, Adwin's muscles had become anemic and enfeebled. He was encouraged, quote, to move his limbs a little, and he found that he was able to move them much more than he expected. He began to make small objects, commencing with cutting and carving, and so at last was able to work again, and to follow the craft of a carpenter. End quote. John Murfield, a canon of St. Bartholomew's Priory, wrote a general treatise on medicine entitled Breviarium Bartholomew, about the year 1380, when Richard Sutton was master of the hospital. This book is of considerable interest, both as an early medical treatise written at a time when this form of literature was not general, and for its connection with the hospital. Dr. Moore gives a full description of the contents and adds, quote, this picture is complete of the medical and surgical practice in St. Bartholomew's Hospital in the reign of Richard II. End quote. London was doubtless well able to supply the hospital with patients, and the dismounted knights in the jousts at Smithfield must have found it convenient to have their wounds attended to at once. It is recorded that when Wat Tyler fell from his horse, half dead from his wounds, he was dragged within the hospital gate, and died in what is now the open space between the church and the outer wall of the great hall. The body was then laid in the master's chamber. Walworth, however, had the body brought out and beheaded, the head being sent to London Bridge to replace that of Archbishop Sudbury. By a composition dated 1373, the master of the hospital was ordered to be presented to the prior of St. Bartholomew's Priory after election, and previous to presentation to the bishop. The last master was John Brereton, who subscribed to the king's supremacy in 1534. The last prior, Robert Fuller, surrendered the priory to the king in 1540. About the year 1423, the famous Richard Whittington repaired the hospital at his own expense. Little more than a century after this, it was refounded by Henry VIII, but with very little pecuniary help from the king. In 1538, the mayor, aldermen, and commonalty of the city of London petitioned Henry VIII that they might from thenceforth have the order, rule, disposition, and governance of St. Mary's Spital, St. Bartholomew's Spital, and St. Thomas's Spital, and the new abbey at Tower Hill, with the rents and revenues appertaining to the same, for the only relief of the poor, sick, and needy persons. In 1544, the king confirmed by letters patent the grant and establishment of St. Bartholomew's Hospital to the master and chaplains, but in 1546 a deed of covenant between Henry VIII and the mayor, commonalty, and citizens of London respecting the hospital was sealed, by which they came under the rule of the city. It is stated in the deed that, quote, His Highness, of his bountiful goodness and charitable mind, was moved with great pity for and towards the relief, aid, succor, and help of the poor, aged, sick, low, and impotent people. End quote. Additional letters patent were issued in 1547. In 1552 was published The Order of the Hospital of St. Bartholomew's in West Smithfield in London, with this text on the title. Quote, First Epistle of John, 2nd chapter. He that saith he walketh in the light, and hateth his brother, came never as zeal in the light. But he that loveth his brother, he dwelleth in the light. End quote. We have already seen how the later years of Raher's life were darkened by the attacks of enemies, and a curious revival of similar slanders appears to have occurred when the hospital was refounded. And so virulent were the slanders that it appears to have been thought that a reply from the governing body was needed, and such a reply is found in the preface to the Order. This commences as follows. Quote, The wickedness of report at this day, good reader, is grown to such rankness that nothing almost is able to defend itself against the venom thereof, but that, either with open slander or privy whispering, it shall be so undermined, that it shall neither have the good success which otherwise it might, nay the thanks which for the worthiness it ought. End quote. Henry VIII being dead, the governing body appeared to have felt it possible to tell the truth as to the little he had done in endowing the hospital. In fact, both Henry VIII and Edward VI have gained credit as founders, when they really did little more than give buildings for public purposes that were of no use to themselves, and then leave others to find the money to support them. The writer of the preface says that the slanderers ought to repent and praise both the deed and the doers so as to wipe away the slander. Quote, But forasmuch as it is doubtful whether they will do as they may, and of conscience are bounden, and the slander is so widespread that a narrow remedy cannot amend it, it is thought good to the Lord Mayor of this city of London, as chief patron and governor of this hospital, in the name of the city, to publish at this present the offices and orders by him appointed, and time to time practised and used by 12 of the citizens the most ancient in their courses, as at large in the process shall appear, partly for the stay and redress of such slander, and partly for that it might be an open witness and knowledge unto all men how things are administered there and by whom, wherein if any man judge more to be set forth in word, then indeed is followed there be means to resolve him. End quote. The case in abstract is as follows. For the relief of the sore and sick of the City of London, Henry VIII was pleased to erect a hospital in West Smithfield for 100 sore and diseased. He endowed it with 500 marks a year, on the condition that the citizens found another 500 marks. The citizens soon discovered that the king's endowment was far under what at first they had hoped. The 500 marks rent was to come from houses in great decay, and some rotten ruinous, so that to make them again worth the wanted revenue was no small charge, and after paying certain pensions, etc., there only remained towards succouring the 100 poor sufficient for the charge of 3 or 4 harlots then lying in childbed. The citizens, therefore, to relieve their own poor and others coming daily out of all quarters of the realm, spent above their covenant of 500 marks yearly not much less than £1,000, which enabled them to receive the number agreed upon. In spite of this, certain busybodies more ready to espy occasion to blame others than skilful to redress things blameworthy indeed, rounded into the ears of the preachers their tender consciences. These preachers took upon them to make known these slanders, so that the good citizens, for their 5 years' loathsome work done for Christ's sake, received only open detraction, and the poor a greater hindrance. During these 5 years, 1547 to 1552, 800 sick folk were healed in the hospital, and 92 died. The preface writer ends by saying that if any man spieth aught in the order worthy to be reformed, he will find those at the hospital glad and willing to reform it, and the city wish, if by any means it is possible, to raise the number of those receiving the benefits of the hospital from 100 to 1,000. The number of district paid officers is given as 7, in this order: 1. The hospitaller. 2. The renter clerk. 3. The butlers. 4. The porter. 5. The matron. 6. The sisters. 12. 7. The beadles. 8. Quote, there are also, as in a kind by themselves, 3 chirurgeons in the wages of the hospital, giving daily attendance upon the cures of the poor. End quote. The charges in this little book of orders are of great interest, and will well repay careful perusal. The surgeons are charged to the uttermost of their knowledge to help cure the diseases of the poor without favouring those with good friends. They are not to admit the incurables, so as to keep out those who are curable. When they dress any diseased person, they are to advise him to sin no more and be thankful unto God. They are to receive no gift from anyone, and never to burden the house with any sick person, for the curing of which person they have received any money. In conclusion, they are to report any wrongdoing to the almoners. The nurses of the present day would be surprised at the stringency of the instructions in the charge to the sisters. Mr. Morant Baker specially refers to one command, quote, and so much as in you shall lie, ye shall avoid and shun the conversation and company of all men. End quote. And adds, quote, an order which, I have no doubt, was as implicitly obeyed then as any similar command would be now. End quote. At the end of the charges is, quote, a daily service for the poor, end quote, and, quote, a thanksgiving unto Almighty God to be said by the poor that are cured in the hospital, at the time of their delivery from thence, upon their knees in the hall before the hospitaller, and 2 masters of this house, at the least. And this the hospitaller shall charge them to learn without the book before they be delivered. End quote. Thomas Vicary, sergeant surgeon to the king, and the foremost surgeon of his time, was first appointed governor of St. Bartholomew's on the 29th of September 1548, and in January 1552 he was made governor for life. He was the first medical officer of the hospital. Dr. Norman Moore describes his position as, quote, intermediate between that of the master of older times and that of the surgeons subsequently appointed. For some years he seems to have had both medical and general charge of the hospital." End quote. At this time, he had long held a distinguished position, although not originally a trained surgeon, and at first in small practice at Maidstone. In 1525, he was junior of the 3 wardens of the Barber Surgeons' Company. In 1528, he was upper warden and one of the surgeons to Henry VIII. On the 29th of April 1530, he was granted the office of Sergeant Surgeon to the King, quote, "as soon as Marcellus de la More shall die, or resign, or forfeit his post." End quote. And in the same year he became master of the Barber Surgeons' Company. Lamore died or disappeared from England at some time after Easter 1535, when he received his last payment. Vicary received his first quarter's salary as sergeant surgeon on the 20th of September 1535, and filled this distinguished office under Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary, and Elizabeth. The sergeant surgeons were originally military surgeons, whose first duty was to attend the king upon the battlefield. John Ranby was the last to perform this duty when he attended George II at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. In 1541, Vicary was appointed first master of the Amalgamated Company of Barbers and Surgeons, and in 1548 he is said to have published for the first time his Anatomy of Man's Body. This work was reprinted in 1577 by the 4 surgeons of St. Bartholomew's Hospital of that time, William Close, Will Betton, Richard Story, and Edward Bailey, who dedicated it to the President and Governors. The book is one of great interest, but Dr. Payne has lately proved that it is not an original work, but merely a réchauffé of an anatomical treatise of the 14th century, from which the greater portion has been transcribed word for word. The first physician of St. Bartholomew's was Dr. Rodrigo Lopes, a Portuguese Jew who was appointed about 1567. St. Thomas's Hospital. This hospital is almost of as great antiquity as St. Bartholomew's. The original hospital belonged to the canons of the Priory of St. Mary Overy, and was situated on the west side of the road running south from London Bridge. In 1207, the hospital was destroyed in the fire which devastated the borough of Southwark, but a temporary building was erected on the old site, now occupied by the Bridge House Hotel and the London and Westminster Bank. Peter de Rupibus, Bishop of Winchester, projected a new hospital on a more suitable site on the east side of the road, and appealed for funds for this purpose by means of a Charter of Indulgence, 1228. Quote, "Behold, at Southwark, an ancient hospital built of old to entertain the poor, has been entirely reduced to cinders and ashes by a lamentable fire. Moreover, the place wherein the old hospital has been founded was less appropriate for entertainment and habitation, both by reason of the straitness of the place and by reason of the lack of water and many other conveniences. According to the advice of us, and of wise men, it is transferred and transplanted to another more commodious site, where the air is more pure and calm, and the supply of water more plentiful." End quote. The new hospital was dedicated to St. Thomas a Becket the martyr, and became independent of St. Mary's Priory. It was frequently referred to as Becket Spital. The third building was erected about 1507, and in 1535, a short time before the dissolution of the religious houses, the custos, or master, the brethren, and the 3 lay sisters had the charge of 40 beds for poor and infirm people who were to be supplied with food and firing. The hospital was refounded in 1553 by Edward VI, and endowed with 4,000 marks a year. It was dedicated to St. Thomas the Apostle, but was often called, in honour of Edward, the King's Hospital. The parish of St. Thomas Apostle, Southwark, contained within its walls the 2 hospitals of St. Thomas and Guy's, and was often called the parish of St. Thomas's Hospital. Thus the old name remained, but the dedication was changed from that of the famous saint of the Middle Ages to that of the Apostle St. Thomas. Dr. Payne, who wrote an essay, quote, on some old physicians of St. Thomas's Hospital, end quote, says that in old times the staff was exclusively surgical. Dr. Eliza Hodson, who was appointed about 1620, was the first named that Dr. Payne could find, but he does not think that Hodson was the first physician. The building, having fallen into disrepair, was entirely rebuilt in 1701 to 1706, and the hospital remained on the same spot from 1228 until 1862, when the property was sold to the South Eastern Railway Company and a new hospital was opened on the Albert Embankment at the southern end of Westminster Bridge. Lepers. There were other medieval hospitals in London besides those now described, which were the two chief ones. Many smaller buildings in the suburbs were devoted to the reception of lepers. Dr. Creighton writes, quote, "The remarkable ordinance of Edward III in 1346 for the expulsion of lepers from London seems to have been the occasion of the founding of two so-called lazar houses, one in Kent Street, Southwark, called the Loke, and the other at Hackney or Kingsland. These are the only two mentioned in the subsequent orders to the porters of the city gates in 1375, and as late as the reign of Henry VI, they are the only two besides the ancient Matilda's Hospital in St. Giles's Fields. Another of the suburban leper hospitals was founded at Highgate by a citizen of 1468, and it is not until the reign of Henry VIII that we hear of the spitals at Mile End, Knightsbridge, and Hammersmith." End quote. Dr. Creighton adds that the Lock was doubtless the house of the, quote, "leprosy apud Bermondsey," end quote, who are designated in the Royal Charter of 1 Henry IV, 1399, as recipients, along with the leprosy of Westminster, St. James's, of £5,000 or £6,000. The village of St. Giles in the Fields is of great interest, largely because the place still retains some of its old special features. Up to the middle of the 19th century, when the Rookery of St. Giles was destroyed and New Oxford Street was built on the site, the lines of its contour were little altered since the hospital was founded at the beginning of the 12th century. The ordinance of Edward III, 1346, and the swearing of the porters of the city gates that they will prevent lepers from entering the city are printed in Riley's Memorials. Dr. Creighton states that, as far as he knows, the ordinance of 1346 is the only one of the kind in English history, and adds, quote, "The statutes of the realm contain no reference to lepers or leprosy from first to last. The references in the rolls of Parliament are to the taxing of their houses and lands. The laws which deprive lepers of marital rights and of heirship appear to have been wholly foreign. In England, leprosy as a bar to succession was made a plea in the law courts." End quote. Doubtless there were many cases of true leprosy in the Middle Ages, but there was a great confusion of diseases under this generic term, and we are told that, quote, "in some instances of leper hospitals with authentic charters, the provision for the leprous was in the proportion of 1 to 3 or 4 of the non-leprous inmates." End quote. It was a very terrible fate for a man or woman to be accused of being a leper, for the sufferers were driven from the haunts of men, and being in many cases uncared for, they grew worse and worse. The disease was largely caused by bad food, and this cause was quite neglected in many places. A monstrous ordinance of the Scottish Parliament at Scone in 1386 is recorded in the ancient laws and customs of the burghs of Scotland. Quote, "Gif ony man brings to the market corrupt swine or salmon to be sold, they shall be taken by the bailey, and incontinent, without ony question, shall be sent to the leper folk. And gif there be now leper folk, they shall be destroyed all utterly." End quote. The Reverend W. Denton, in quoting this instance of horrible cruelty, writes, quote, "Sir Walter Scott must have had instances of such economy in his mind when he put into the mouth of John Girder the directions, quote, 'Let the house be redd up, the broken meat set by, And if there be ony thing totally uneatable, let it be gi'en to the pure folk. Bride of Lammermuir. End quote. Men sometimes took advantage of a charge of leprosy to injure an enemy. In 1468, Joanna Nightingale of Brentwood in Essex was accused of leprosy. She refused to remove herself to a solitary place, and appealed to Edward IV, who issued a chancery warrant for her examination by his physicians and certain lawyers to be associated with them. The Court of Inquiry reported that they found the woman to be in no way leprous, nor to have any sign of lepra. This case is recorded in Rymer's Foedera. There was another evil caused by the privilege of begging which was accorded to lepers, for men sometimes pretended to be lepers in order to avail themselves of this privilege. It is worthy of mention, in passing, that the two districts of London which have given their names to the extremes of high and low life, viz., St. James's and St. Giles, both have their origin in the leper hospitals of the Middle Ages. End of Chapter 7, Part 2. End of Section 12.